This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally: Gwyn K., Politi, Jan H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, Thaddeus G., V! V, and Mary Beth R. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Chthonia is now an affiliate of the Divine Feminine app. Whether you download the app on your phone or subscribe via the website, the Divine Feminine app is a great resource to find sacred circles and events related to the Divine Feminine, as well as books, blogs, and other resources for those interested in pagan practice or in the myth and psychology surrounding the subject. Click on the link in the description on Spreaker or YouTube for this podcast to find out more information and to register for free. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke. And our subject this week is going to be the last figure that I address in my Female Christian Mystics series, at least for now. If I get any other requests in that series at a future date, I may add some more. But we've covered some of the pretty big heavy hitters. We've covered the Doctors of the Church. And this week I would like to cover the anchoress Julian of Norwich. Now, Julian of Norwich there's really very little that's known about her, other than that she is said to be an anchorite who was living in a cell in St. Julian's Church in Norwich, in England. And we don't even know that that's actually her name. There is a book that she had written that is often referred to as the Revelations of Divine Love, and there is what they call a short text and a long text. And since probably the early 20th century, there's been a lot of speculation about her. I remember when I was working in libraries, I couldn't, literally in boxes of donations and things, I couldn't go in without tripping over a copy of Julian of Norwich's work. It was the same edition, and I can't remember who the publisher was exactly. But, of course, I had one of these copies, and to my chagrin, when I was starting to do this podcast, I said, I've got to have one of those Julian of Norwich copies somewhere. And I don't. So I know I had read it a long time ago, along with some other mystical works. At that time, I know I had read The Cloud of Unknowing, which does actually factor in here. And of course, I've read Teresa of Avila, as I'd mentioned in one of the very first discussions in this series. Actually, she was the very first female Christian mystic that I had discussed. But this one, we're going to try to be a little concise with this episode and try to focus on some of the core things that we need to take away from the work of Julian of Norwich and how this connects in with ideas that we have about the divine feminine in particular, as well as potentially the dark feminine. We'll see where that aspect may come into play here. But what I do want to talk about are a few things in my notes for this episode. The first thing I want to do is talk about what an anchoress is, or an anchorite, what that word means. And then I want to give a little bit of the cultural context for Julian of Norwich, the time period in which she lived, and what little bit is known about her, or at least is surmised by scholars about her. And then I want to talk a little bit about her writing, which was called as I mentioned, the Revelations of Divine Love. Actually, looks like it's called 16 Revelations of Divine Love. Right, because she had 16 visions when she was very, very ill. And this is a theme we've seen repeated with other mystics, where they fall into either a trance or they fall into a state where they are suffering so much that they actually have like last rites set over them. They think they're going to die, and instead they pull through, and then they have these visions that they come back with. I don't know whether this really counts as kind of a near-death experience, but certainly some of it, there's certainly these visions that take place, and a lot of times you will hear that the person in question who has seen this vision has prayed for the sickness to come upon them, because they know that in that state, this may be the state of suffering out of which they will actually get beyond the body, so to speak, to that which is that which is not corporeal. So it's interesting because a lot of the theology that we're going to be looking at here comes from a tradition that is known as the Via Negativa, or I'm speaking in classical Latin, we'll say the Via Negativa, right? The way of negation. And it's really, I think, almost a pattern or a tenet of mystical writing, because it has to do with talking. You can't talk about what God is. You can only talk about what God is not. So I'm gonna get into that as I move on through this episode. But the first thing I do want to talk about is Julian as an anchorite. So what do we mean by an anchorist? Well, an anchorist is somebody who goes into seclusion, literally. So what happens is they would have to, the way it's described here, I'm just going to describe it, what the Wikipedia entry has here is actually quite accurate. So they said she was an anchorist from at least the 1390s. Okay, so I think she was born in the 1340s. Living in her cell, she would have played an important part within the community, devoting herself to a life of prayer to complement the clergy in their primary function as protectors of souls. Her solitary life would have begun after the completion of an onerous selection process. An important church ceremony would have taken place at St. Julian's Church in the presence of the bishop. During the ceremony, psalms from the office of the dead would have been sung for Julian, as if it were her funeral, and at some point she would have been led to her cell door and into the room beyond. The door would afterwards have been sealed up, and she would have remained in her cell for the rest of her life. So you are anchored to the church, quite literally. You are, well, maybe not quite literal, it's not an actual anchor, but the idea is that you have a cell, you are in this cell of the church, and the door is sealed, you do not leave. There is a window, of course, so they are able to, that's where you're able to meet with people. That's where perhaps, I'm sure, food is passed in and everything, because the person's not left to starve to death. It's not like being walled up alive, but there's no leaving that room again. The anchoress remains in that room, but the anchoress does actually see people, which is supposed to be an expert in prayer and contemplation. And there was something written, I believe, in around 1162. The Anchorine Rule is what it was called. It was written in Middle English around 1200. It was originally made for 3 sisters. The Anchorine Rule became, in time, a manual for all female recluses. It regained its former popularity during the mystical movement of the 14th century. It may have been available to Julian to read and become familiar with, being a book written in a language she could read. The book stipulated that anchoresses should live in confined isolation, in poverty, and under a vow of chastity. Kind of like nuns, only nuns don't live in isolation necessarily, unless they belong to certain contemplative orders. This is really another version of a contemplative order. It says, there is a popular image of Julian living with her cat for company. Well, that's all you need, right? Stems from the regulations set out in the Anchorine Rule. Okay. Now, as it mentions here, as an anchoress living in the heart of an urban environment, because Norwich was a very big spiritual center, certainly at this point in the Middle Ages, Julian would not have been entirely secluded. She would have enjoyed the financial support of the more prosperous members of the local community. And in fact, there are 4 wills that were found of people who are of nobility or royalty who leave money to Julian in their will. And in fact, that's the only way that they know that her name is Julian, or at least people are not sure whether her name is identified with St. Julian's Church, where she was walled up, or where she was sealed in, I guess is a more proper way to put it, where she was sealed up in the church, or whether or not that was her actual name, because it most certainly could have been her name. But there are 4 wills that mention her as Julian. One leaves 12 shillings, another leaves 12 pennies, and which doesn't sound like very much now, probably was a lot then. So she's mentioned in these wills, and she's also mentioned in the autobiography of Marjorie Kemp, who's another female Christian mystic, who is said to have had an audience with Julian and had taken much advice on mystical vision and so forth from Julian. So this is how we know about her. It said she would, enjoy the financial support of the more prosperous members of the local community as well as the general affection of the population. She would have in turn provided prayers and given advice to visitors, serving as an example of devout holiness. According to one edition of the Cambridge Medieval History, it's possible she met the English mystic Walter Hilton. Is that Hilton? Yes, it is Hilton. Yes, okay. I was making sure that I was reading the name right. I wanted to say Hitton or Hinton, but it's actually Hilton, who died when Julian was in her 50s and may have influenced her writings in a small way. So this is what we mean when we talk about an anchorite. And this was I don't want to say it's common that everybody was running off being anchorites, but certainly it was something that you do hear of women doing in the medieval period, and presumably you have to be somebody, I think as we'd mentioned with the St. Catherine of Siena podcast, you have to be somebody who has enough money to do that, because you have to give a kind of dowry to the church, so to speak, quote unquote, to be the bride of the church. Now, what's not clear is whether or not Julian was actually a nun. Now, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the New Advent, which is the official line Catholic Encyclopedia, they assume that she probably was a nun in the local tradition. So how'd they put it? She was probably a Benedictine nun living as a recluse in Anchorage, which traces still remain in the east part of the churchyard of St. Julian in Norwich, which belonged to Carrow Priory. However, as it's been pointed out elsewhere, there's really no record of anyone, matching her description belonging to the Carrow Abbey, belonging to that group of nuns. So there has been another theory that's been put out that she was actually a widowed mother. So let's get into the background here about when she was living. Okay, Julian lived in the English city of Norwich, an important center for commerce that also had a vibrant religious life. During her lifetime, the city suffered the devastating effects of the Black Death of 1348 to 1350 and the Peasants' Revolt, which affected large parts of England in 1381, and the suppression of the Lollards. In 1373, aged 30 and so seriously ill she thought she was on her deathbed, Julian received a series of visions, or shewings, as they call them, of the Passion of Christ. She recovered from her illness and wrote 2 versions of her experiences. Okay, now it said she was born, the birth date given for her is November 8th, 1343. Although I've also seen 1342 somewhere. They're saying about 1343. And that she died after 1416. That's about all we know. We still don't know. We don't know where she was. We don't know what her... I assume... I don't know if that's actually a good question. I'm assuming that there's some kind of a gravesite for her, but maybe there's not. I don't know. I don't know if we only know about her from these wills that mention her, from Marjorie Kemp's biography, and also from her writings that were not published initially during the Protestant Reformation. They would not allow them to be published, which is when you first had the printing press, because of her Catholic association. But later on, they were eventually published, much later on. Okay, English city of Norwich, where Julian probably lived all her life, was second in importance to London during the 13th and 14th centuries, and the center of the country's primary region for agriculture and trade. During her lifetime, the Black Death reached Norwich. The disease may have killed over half the population of the city and returned in subsequent outbreaks up to 1387. Julian was alive during the Peasant Revolt of 1381, when the city was overwhelmed by rebel forces led by Geoffrey Lister. Henry le Despencer, the Bishop of Norwich, executed Lister, there's an extra T in there, after the peasant army was defeated. Despencer zealously opposed the Lollards, who advocated reform of the church, and some of them were burnt at the stake at Lollards Pit, just outside the city. Norwich may have been one of the most religious cities in Europe at that time, with its cathedral, friaries, churches, and recluses' cells dominating both the landscape and the lives of its citizens. On the eastern side of the city was the Cathedral Priory, founded in 1096, the Benedictine Hospital of St. Paul, the Carmelite Friary, St. Giles Hospital, and the Greyfriars Monastery. To the south, the Priory at Carrow, a Benedictine foundation, was located just beyond the city walls. Its income was mainly generated from livings acquired from the renting of its assets, which included Norwich churches of St. Julian, All Saints Timberhill, St. Edward Conisford, and St. Catherine Newgate, all now lost apart from St. Julian's. The churches with anchorite cells enhanced the reputation of the priory as they attracted endowments from across society. So yeah, this was a money-making venture for them. So this is the kind of environment that she's in. We're right in the period of the Black Death. You're right in the period of the Peasants' Revolt. And she doesn't actually mention either of these things in her writing. Now, whether this is because she was in a cell away from everybody, who knows? I think it's surmised that the fact that she went into this kind of seclusion may have been something that might have spared her from the Black Death, honestly. But again, it's not really known. That's just speculation. There's also speculation because she spends a lot of her writing talking about motherhood, okay, or Christ as mother, which we're going to get into her theology. But when she talks about this idea, there has led to some speculation among scholars that this means that she herself may have been a mother, and that perhaps with the Black Death, or perhaps with all the other things that were going on, perhaps she was a mother who had children and then probably lost her family. Maybe they all died, and maybe she's the only one who survived. Who knows? Maybe that is even the reason why she decided to become an anchorite. I mean, we don't know that. That is pure speculation on my part, though there is some scholarship out there that discusses it, and those are probably the better sources to read with regard to what the researched speculation might be. But yeah, there were 4 wills made by individuals who lived in Norwich. Roger Reed, rector of St. Michael, whose will of 20 March 1394 provides the earliest record of Julian's existence, makes a bequest of 12 shillings to be paid to Julian anchorite. Thomas Edmund, a chantry priest from Elsham, I don't know if I'm saying that right, stipulated in his will of 19 May 1404 that 12 pennies be given to Julian anchoress of the Church of St. Julian, Conisford, and 8 pennies to Sarah living with her. Okay, well that's interesting because that implies that she might not be living by herself, but okay. John Plumpton from Norwich gave 40 pennies to the anchoress in the Church of St. Julian's, Conisford, and a shilling each to her maid and her former maid, Alice, in his will dated 24 November 1415. The 4th person to mention Julian was Isabel, Countess of Suffolk, who made a bequest of 20 shillings to Julian Reclus à Norwich in her will dated 26 September 1416. As a bequest to an unnamed anchorite at St. Julian's was made in 1429, there's possibility she was still alive at this time. So this is the background that we have on her and the context. And as you can see, we can only speculate about what kind of life she had based on what we know about anchorite living, okay, and what else we know about the context of that society at the time. Now, why she ended up being a revered mystic? Now, you could say yes, well, she's an anchorite, but there were plenty of anchorites, and certainly they were there to provide spiritual guidance and direction. But okay, so let's talk about these visions. Julian wrote in Revelations of Divine Love that she became seriously ill at the age of 30. She could have been an anchoress when she fell ill, although it is possible she was a lay person living at home, as she was visited by her mother and other people, and the rules of enclosure for an anchoress would not normally have allowed outsiders such access. On the 8th of May 1373, curate administered the last rites of the church to her, in anticipation of her death. As he held the crucifix above the foot of her bed, she began to lose her sight and feel physically numb, but gazing on the crucifix, she saw the figure of Jesus begin to bleed. Over the next several hours, she had a series of 15 visions of Jesus, and the 16th on the following night. That's interesting. I always find the wounds of Christ thing to be very interesting because I have an association with blood. Blood has such a strong association that it's very Chtonic. It's very, very close to the earth. Certainly, when we talk about ancient ideas about death, blood has a tremendous amount to do with life. If you read, we'll just take the obvious examples of things like the Odyssey, the what they call the Nicaea, when Odysseus and Circe go down to do a necromantic ritual to bring back Tiresias. What they have to do, they have the blood of a black ram. I think that's what it was. When that blood drips into the pit, that's the dead come and drink from the blood. There's this strong connection of blood to life. I mean, this is the whole idea of sacrifice. It's even the idea behind the sacrifice of Jesus. Because in theory, he says, take my body and eat, take my blood and drink. I mean, yes, that may be symbolic, metaphorical, or transubstantiated, or whatever you want to say. But you still have this idea of something very substantial, although it's supposed to be more like a spiritual food, I suppose. But nonetheless, there's this very corporeal, however you want to say that, corporeal connection to the body and blood of Christ, which is definitely very heavily embodied, particularly in Orthodoxy and in Catholicism. And so her vision starts with the bleeding Jesus. This is something making him very substantial in a kind of fleshly, like corporeal way. And we think about this also with Catherine of Siena. We're talking about the foreskin of Jesus and things like that, where we have this very, very embodied view once again. When we start to have that kind of thing. I mean, the whole idea of the stigmata, that one takes on the wounds of Christ. That's, again, this very embodied and corporeal idea about the mystic, about the spiritual, because it's not just some abstract idea. When we talk about the Via Negativa, we're talking about what God is not. You can't describe God in material terms. And yet here we're having these very, very material, very almost, I'm going to say almost Chtonic in the sense of their connection to death and to blood and to things like that. So anyway, so it says she recovered completely from her illness on the 13th of May. And there's general agreement that she wrote about her shewings, as they were called, shortly after she experienced them. Her original manuscript no longer exists, but a copy, now known as the short text, survived. Decades later, perhaps in the early 1390s, she began a theological exploration of the meaning of her visions and produced writings now known as the long text. This second work seems to have gone through many revisions before it was finished, perhaps in the 1410s or 1420s. Julian's Revelations seem to be the first important example of a vision by an Englishwoman for 200 years, in contrast with the continent, where a golden age of women's mysticism occurred during the 13th and 14th centuries. Yeah, I mean, what's unique about her is that she is uniquely a mystic who is connected to England specifically, whereas many of these other mystics who we are talking about are in France, or they are in Spain, or perhaps in Italy, but not necessarily specifically or in Germany, but not specifically in England. Okay, so I'm just going to take a look at this about her biography before we get into her actual text here. According to several commentators, including Santa Bhattacharjee in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Julian's discussion of the maternal nature of God suggests she knew motherhood from her own experience of bringing up children. As plague epidemics were rampant during the 14th century, it has been suggested that Julian may have lost her own family as a result. By becoming an anchorite, she would have been kept in quarantine away from the rest of the population of Norwich, like I'd said earlier. However, nothing in Julian's writings provides any indication of the plagues, religious conflict, or civil insurrection that occurred in the city during her lifetime. Kenneth Leach and Sister Benedicta Ward, the joint authors of Julian Reconsidered, 1988, concluded that she was a young widowed mother and never a nun. They based their opinion on a dearth of references about her occupation in life, and lack of evidence to connect her with Carrow Abbey, which would have honored her and buried her in the grounds had she been strongly connected with the priory. Now, again, the Catholic Encyclopedia still thinks that she was probably a nun, but when you have these different types of clergy, it's interesting to me if she wasn't a nun, okay, if she's not actually listed as being a nun, and if we consider her, and if we also consider, I think it was Catherine of Siena, was it Catherine of Siena who was, you consider these other women, I'm getting them kind of mixed up in my head, but not all of them were nuns. Okay, and that's interesting as well, that these were secular women. They were part of the laity. They were not, they had not taken vows. They'd taken some kind of vows, but they were still living in the world. And it's interesting that these people who were living in the world and among people, which again, some nuns do. I don't want to say that when someone becomes a nun that they're automatically not involved with the world. But that they're, because again, those are just certain orders that are not, that would be contemplative and therefore secluded, like the Discalced Carmelites, for instance. They might not have a whole lot of interaction with the outside world. There's this whole idea of prayer and work, and one just stays within their community. And if it's a silent community, then there might not even be any speech. It may just be literally a life of contemplation. But a lot of the nuns, of course, today, we see are definitely on them. They go out, they go to different countries to aid the poor. They have all kinds of other work that they do. Some of them are teachers. Many of us who went to Catholic school certainly knows about the Sisters of Christian Charity, who always seem to teach, at least in the Catholic schools on the East Coast. There were other orders as well that were connected to that, but it's there's this idea that she may have been a regular person who later took up a religious life. And so you have this idea of these women who have this secular connection, and I feel like the ones with the secular connections seem to also be the ones who talk the most about embodiment, who talk about their mystical visions in probably the most embodied terms. But they also the ones that seem to talk about this very feminine side of God as well, which is not something you necessarily see in some of the others. Although Hildegard of Bingen, she was in a convent from the age of like 8 or something, really young. She was raised that way. And she, of course, has a whole lot about the connection to nature and the natural sciences and everything else. So yeah, maybe not. I don't know. I'm just musing on the fact that a lot of the mystics and a lot of the women, if they're not, like in her case, she's not yet been declared. Julian of Norwich is not a doctor of the church, but she's considered to be a beata. She's on a list, but she hasn't been declared that yet. And it's interesting, though, that you have these women who are doctors of the church, and they talk about the relationship to God as something that is non-dual, and they talk about it as something that is very, very feminine in its inflection. So let's talk a little bit about her revelations of divine love. Now, it says her writings were largely unknown until 1670. Again, because I'd mentioned they would not allow them to be published during the Protestant Reformation. Julian's writings were largely unknown until 1670, when they were published under the title 16 Revelations of Divine Love, showed to a devout servant of our Lord called Mother Juliana, an anchorite of Norwich, who lived in the days of King Edward III, by Serenus de Cressy, a confessor for the English nuns at Cambrai. Cressy based his book on the long text, because we mentioned there's a short text of Julian's writings, and then the longer text seems to be her longer theological reflections. And they've noted here that they include that it seems clear that she's read the letters of Catherine of Siena, who was roughly contemporary, or at least actually probably would have been a bit before her, because I think Catherine of Siena died. I'm not sure how many years before. So she was influenced. It seems clear that she was familiar with the letters of Catherine of Siena. There seems to be some Neoplatonic stuff in her long text, which they have related back to the Cloud of Unknowing. Cloud of Unknowing is kind of it's a handbook for prayer, is what it is, and it has to do with contemplative prayer in particular. And it's connected to what I mentioned earlier, the theology of the Via Negativa, the way of negation, which basically says that you can only talk about what God is not. You cannot talk about what God is. Because when you're talking about the concept of God, you can only point to the concept. Like all these visions just point to the concept. Those visions are not actually God. They're just something that you see that the mind can connect with. You see visions of Jesus on the cross. Well, yeah, that's what your mind connects with. That's what your mind associates with God. So that's the way that you connect to that numinous, unknowable force. It's a matter of dealing with God as the unknowable. But that's not something that people tend to do in day-to-day life. This is why they don't. This is at least one of the reasons, I should say, that the church doesn't look for mystics, for the ordinary average person to get involved in mysticism, because it requires getting away from the forms, like living a kind of an abstraction that would require being away from the world, or at least theoretically that's how it works. I think people living a day-to-day life most certainly are capable of grasping the unknowable parts of it. I think the harder piece there is to have that unknowable piece. Well, really, maybe it's not hard to have that unknowable piece and then to be back in the world, and to recognize that those two things are not a contradiction. I think that's where I would go with that they're not a contradiction. But if you are in the habit of separating the material and the spiritual, then you would say, well, yes, but to be spiritual, you can't be living in this material world. And that's an idea that we see in the East as well. The whole idea of renunciates or brahmacharinis or swamis in the Far East, and then you have the way we have a monastic clergy here in the West. Okay, so they're talking about the different copies of the long text that have survived. So let's talk about the theology in these. It says, Julian of Norwich is now recognized as one of England's most important mystics. According to Lacer, she was the greatest English anchoress. For the theologian Dennis Turner, the core issue Julian addresses in Revelations of Divine Love is the problem of sin. Julian says that sin is behovely, which is often translated as necessary, appropriate, and fitting. Ooh, okay. So here's theological point number one. Julian says that sin is behovely. And that's not normally what we would say. We'd say that sin's an abomination and we should avoid it. And she's saying no, but it's something necessary. So Julian lived in a time of turmoil, but her theology was optimistic and spoke of God's omnibenevolence and love in terms of joy and compassion. Revelations of Divine Love contains a message of optimism based on the certainty of being loved by God and of being protected by his providence. A characteristic element of Julian's mystical theology was her equating divine love with motherly love, a theme found in the biblical prophets as in Isaiah. According to Julian, God is both the mother and the father. Okay. As the medievalist Carolyn Walker Bynum shows, this idea was also developed by Bernard of Clairvaux, we've heard of him before in connection with Hildegard of Bingen, and others from the 12th century onward. Bynum regards the medieval notion of Jesus as a mother as being a metaphor rather than a literal belief. In her 14th Revelation, Julian writes of the Trinity in domestic terms, comparing Jesus to a mother who is wise, loving, and merciful. Author Francis Beer asserted that Julian believed that the maternal aspect of Christ was literal and not metaphoric. Christ is not like a mother, he is literally the mother. Which is interesting, because when we talk about this idea of the feminine in Christian parlance and the idea of the Christian Trinity. Carl Jung had postulated a fourth, that you have the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Father and Son being masculine, Holy Spirit really being probably originally feminine, but considered to be neutral. The term is used as paraclete, which is a neutral term for the Holy Spirit. And that he considered the Virgin Mary to be the fourth, that divine feminine piece that was missing. And this is why Jung had privileged Catholicism over other types of belief, because you had this divine feminine component, which he said that that's why he referred to it as a quaternary. And a psychological quaternary and again, he felt Catholicism was trying to approach this religious language that we would connect with the collective unconscious. I mean, although I don't want to imply that the collective unconscious is entirely religious, but that is where religious symbolism comes from in that kind of thinking. And so he would say you have to have that element, that feminine element. Now, many of us would argue that that's not really a very strong enough feminine element. But it's really interesting that we go back to the writings of the mystics when we see this very patriarchal interpretation of things that keeps the feminine out. And I mean, this is even the Catholicism that I had learned when I went to Catholic school and we had to take religion classes. There was definitely, because people would talk about this. Well, where is this? And they would say, well, there's a Virgin Mary, but she's not really equal. Or you would have the cult of the saints, or you would have, this is where you end up pulling this kind of influence in. The closest you have to dark feminine in Catholicism is the presence of the Black Madonnas. Still a type of approach to God that is, once again, not considered for the everyday person. When I think about Judaism, when we talk about the Shekinah, the presence of God in the world, in Malkut, which is the kingdom, that's in the world. And when you had the Jewish temples with the Holy of Holies, the Shekinah is the presence in the Holy of Holies. In other words, it's the manifestation of God in the world. That presence in the world, in that chamber, in that Holy of Holies, but only very, very select people could go to that Holy of Holies. And as I've said, people will say, no, Shekinah is not female, not meant to be female. It's a feminine word. Okay, so, and it's this idea of the manifestation is in the world or in the earth, which is the feminine component. Okay, as we've seen over and over again, it's often described as the celestial as being the masculine sphere and the earth being the feminine sphere, with the exceptions that we've noted in places like Egypt, where it seems to be flipped, where the sky is actually feminine and the earth is masculine. And there are other cultures also that do reverse those things. But it certainly in Western culture, anything influenced by Rome, it's definitely, you are looking at a culture that is where you have a feminine earth and a masculine sky. Erich Neumann's work, Fear of the Feminine, talks about this at length as well, and I talk about it in my book, Death and the Maiden, about how these kinds of associations tends to demonize the feminine. But here what we're seeing is an example of the feminine as being something that is an integral part of the divine. And, of course, as with Hildegard of Bingen, that nature is an inherent part of the divine, which is very different from the narrative that says that nature is corrupt. So it's interesting that this has been part of Catholic theology, but it's a theology that has been put aside only, in theory, for a select few. Only those who want to go into deep contemplation, only those who might go into a religious order, or enter one of the church's secular orders, which do exist still, by the way. You could, as a person, not say if you're female, you could join an order and not be a nun, but you could be, belong to a secular order and have to follow secular rules. So those things do exist and they do happen still, but we don't hear about them quite as much. But so it seems like the religion managed to be in every part of life here. So let's get back to her theology here. Julian emphasized the motherly aspect of Christ by explaining how the bond between mother and child is the only earthly relationship that comes close to the relationship a person can have with Jesus. She used metaphors when writing about Jesus in relation to ideas about conceiving, giving birth, weaning, and upbringing. Julian wrote, and I do vaguely remember reading this, For I saw no wrath except on man's side, and he forgives that in us, he with a capital H, meaning Jesus or God. For wrath is nothing else but a perversity and an opposition to peace and love. She wrote that God sees us as perfect and waits for the day when human souls mature so that evil and sin will no longer hinder us, and that God is nearer to us than to our own soul. This theme is repeated throughout her work. Jesus answered with these words, saying, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Now, if you've heard that phrasing before, actually, okay, what's not often mentioned is there's a book by Dr. Elaine Pagels called Revelations. And Revelations is about all of the books of Revelation. Now, when we think of the Bible, we think of the book of Revelation that's at the end, right, of the canon of the Bible as it's generally established, as we have the book of Revelation with all its scary things. This is where we have the idea of beast and Babylon, and the archangels and the trumpets and the 12 gates and yada yada. Okay, so it's all that whole vision of John of Patmos. However, as Dr. Pagels points out, this is only one of a number of books of Revelation that could have been chosen for the Bible when the canon was decided upon in the 380s, around Council of Nicaea. But they chose the one that talks about separating the wheat from the chaff, the holy from the unjust, the corrupt from the good, the way in which divine judgment is emphasized. But Dr. Pagels points out that all the other books of Revelation basically have Jesus returning and saying, "All will be well." And all will be well. So that's the first place I've heard it. Now, the other place where you'll find this phrasing is T.S. Eliot's poem, Four Quartets. In one of them called Little Gidding, he actually says this, and I think they do mention it down here. Let me see if I can find it. Yes. "And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flames are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one." Okay, so that's from Little Gidding by T.S. Eliot. So, and that was at least one of the places. I mean, so clearly he had read her writings, which makes sense because T.S. Eliot was definitely a fan of the Catholic Church, and he was an Anglophile and a fan of the Catholic Church. But we do see this in Eliot does bring a lot of these elements into his poetry. So. Yeah, so we have this idea, all will be well, all will be well. So this gets back to the idea of those books of Revelation that were actually rejected for the Bible. And the reason that Dr. Pagels had said that they were rejected was because they wanted the idea that people like the idea of divine justice. They like the idea that living a good life means something, which again is a very philosophical idea. I mean, from a social perspective, okay, yes, well, we want people to like us, and we want to be able to like other people, right? That's not the way anything works, because we always live in a society where there's always going to be somebody who's going to be in opposition to something that you're doing. I mean, we have opposing forces all the time that have to be, they fight their way out, or in the same way that you might think of cold and hot air hitting each other and you having thunderstorms. They're going to have all these different currents, and they are going to come together not always in the most harmonious way. Although what the mystics will tell you is that there is still a harmonious flow even within the sort of chaotic absurdities that we get involved in day-to-day life. She has definitely this idea of a Jesus of mercy, and she says that all of divine revelation can be explained in terms of love. So yeah, there is something very Neoplatonic about it, and definitely we can see elements of the Via Negativa philosophy here, which says, again, that you can't talk about God in human terms. So when we talk about God as a judge, okay, or if you talk about God as being involved in some kind of very personal way, or God is supporting a particular government, or doing this, or doing you can't really talk about God in those terms, is what the mystics will tell you. The Via Negativa says you can only deal with the fact that you don't know. You can only deal with God in the state of unknowing. That's why you had that particular text was called the Cloud of Unknowing. The author was anonymous. It was a 14th century text, so it would have been roughly contemporary with Julian's lifetime. But that is the mystical experience. And that's another thing I think that is often considered to be dangerous about the mystical experience, is the fact that when you say all will be well, Jesus is going to forgive all sinners and all is going to be well, and sin is an inherent part of life, and the mystery of life is, because the mystery of life is greater than that. There's an implication there that sin actually does have a purpose. When you look at things from the point of view of theodicy that says, well, God is omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omnipresent, so all good, all powerful, all knowing, omniscient, all knowing. So if God is omnibenevolent, then people say, well, then where does evil come from? How can evil be in the world? Because if God can't prevent evil, then God isn't omnipotent, isn't all powerful. But then if God does allow evil, can get rid of evil and doesn't, then it becomes, well, then God's not omnibenevolent. That's the conundrum that's the wall that you often hit in theology. And of course, there are various what they call theodicies that try to explain away the problem of evil. But this is a kind of theodicy here that says, no, that's actually part of it. Yeah, you wouldn't, and that's something actually a bit more Eastern, I think, because I feel like there's more of a Hindu inflection there that says, that you see when you get to the mystical levels of Christianity and the mystical levels of religion. That was something I discovered after I spent time in enough convent libraries, like reading through monastic texts and so forth, and recognizing like, wow, this is a Catholicism that I was never told about, not the one I was raised with. And it's like, yeah, well, that's the Catholicism for you. This is the Catholicism for contemplatives. Which is why there's a lot of people. That's why even at one time in my life, I considered becoming a contemplative, because I was like, damn, there's a lot in here. But it's not, ultimately, there's a lot of reasons that would not be the path for me. But but that was just really interesting to me. And when she talks about love as being the central thing, the central part of the theology, that the real divine revelation is love. I think back to what Teresa of Avila says about that prayer of quiet, that opening of the heart center that occurs when one takes the Eucharist, when one's able to have, that's literally why it's called communion, because when you take it, it does something inside that actually opens up the heart. So yeah, so that's why, and that being the center of love, this is why love is really the central faction in all things. But when you are in that space of quiet and you recognize all the crap going on in the world around you, it gives you a very different view of it, because you're viewing it from the perspective away from the noise, and you're viewing it from the perspective of really the unknowable. I mean, you're not the unknowable. Well, maybe you're part of it. I don't know. But it's just, there's a different perspective on it that makes you recognize that everything just is as it's supposed to be. And I know I've said this before, but that's what a lot of this theology gets back to. Everything is as it's supposed to be, even if there's many things about it that are, from our perspective, wrong, or that need to be fixed, or are painful, or traumatic, or triggering. Everything's somehow as it's supposed to be. And a lot of times people don't like to hear that. They feel almost like, well, that's offensive. Like you're saying that it's perfectly okay that this bad thing happened to me. And that's not really what that's saying. It's just pointing out that when you really start to step back from the mysteries of life, you're talking about what things are not. Okay, that's why you have this via negativa. You're talking about what things are not. And when you get into that space, you're in the midst of a mystery where you just can't, there's the stuff that goes on in your day-to-day life, the crap that we get up and worry about every single day really kind of loses its importance in that space. So anyway, I don't want to go too far off on that tangent, but there's this idea, okay, the anchorite is somebody who is in this in-between space. You walk through the door and they seal it on the one side, and now you've just got the window, which is the only thing between you and the world. You're pretty much sealed up for the rest of your life in this room. Then you are really in a liminal space. You are outside of, it's like they have the rights of the dead said for you. I mean, you're both alive and dead at the same time. You're in a liminal space. And it's from that liminal space that the mystery becomes revealed, right? Because you're no longer solidly identified with what we think of as day-to-day life and the normal mundane operations of things. I mean, but you are and you aren't, right? Because obviously they would live a very simple life of prayer and they have their rules. So it's not like there's no order in that particular way of being. It's not that there aren't rules, but and again, that provides an independence too, because one of the things that was noted here in this entry was they said that her writings may not have been challenged because she was an anchoress. There might not have been anybody to challenge her writings. I think I was beginning to say this before. One of the things about mysticism that's threatening is this idea that all will be well, that mercy is shown to everyone, and that everything ultimately is about finding joy. And that's not the vision that people frequently want you to have in a view. It's contrary to the view that we have for the laity that says that is more dualistic, that is more divisive. You're subject to sins of the flesh. And your actions could potentially land you in hell or in purgatory or something like that. You're not. There's this idea of judgment and you having to watch your step and this idea of fear and this solid judgment between good and evil and good and bad and all these kinds of things, where you don't see that dualism kind of melts away in mystical writings, and that is one of the things that's said about her, is that her writings are considered to be non-dualistic. And to take Christ and turn Christ into a mother figure, that there's almost something Gnostic about that, right? The idea of the cosmic Christ appearing, Sophia appearing as later being the cosmic Christ, but initially appearing as the serpent in the garden, which again is very different theology that you see within elements of Gnosticism, and that what we think of as Yahweh as the demiurge as being actually the evil god in that particular idea, which is again very philosophical. A lot of that comes out of the philosophies that were occurring around the time of the Roman Empire. Now it was, let's see, I had something else that I had seen here that I want to mention. Okay, yeah, this is in the New Advent Encyclopedia, the Catholic one. It says, like St. Catherine, Juliana has little of the dualism of body and soul that is frequent in the mystics. God is in our sensuality as well as our substance, and the body and soul render mutual aid. Either of them take help of other till we be brought up to stature as a kind of work, as kind worketh. Okay, they're writing it in this kind of older parlance. Knowledge of God and knowledge of self are inseparable. We may never come to the knowing of one without the knowing of the other. God is nearer to us than to our own soul, and in falling and rising, we are ever preciously kept in one love. She lays special stress upon the homeliness and courtesy of God's dealings with us, for love maketh might and wisdom full meek to us, which gets back to Jesus' Beatitudes, right? With this we must correspond by happy confidence. Failing of comfort is the most mischief into which the soul can fall. And the Blessed Virgin, the Lord, would have all mankind see how they are loved. Throughout her revelation, Juliana submits herself to the authority of the Church. Okay. So, yeah, that's the interesting thing. It's this idea of the relationship to God is like that of a mother to a child. And that the only mischief you can come into is to basically, show distress or perhaps maybe probably a lack of gratitude. Probably a lack of gratitude would be the thing. And that's interesting because that's the problem that we have of the mind. It's an extremely feminine theology because it doesn't have that problem of the mind. When the mind tries to dissect everything, when we sit there and we judge all of our actions and that was a good thing to do, that was shameful, that was this, that was that. When we start getting into all of these judgments, then we're never happy. We never live our lives because we're spending all our time doubting everything that we do. And doubting our next move and worrying about our appearance and so forth or just worrying about what we don't have rather than what we have. And so I feel like that's what this theology points back to, the idea of kind of this nurturing mother figure, which of course is very, very earth connected. And very embodied, and she's talking about God in what they call homely terms or domestic terms. Okay, so you're bringing it. We're not only talking about the feminine in terms of the earth, but also in terms of domesticity, which still at that point would have been a very feminine associated thing. Probably still is in a lot of ways. I'm not saying necessarily in terms of people's roles, but that's often when we talk about the domestic sphere. I think it's still often thought of as a type of feminine sphere. So she's talking about this very maternal, down-to-earth, homely, in that sense of the word, interpretation of God and of understanding God as the mother who will look after their children. And of course, if you have children who do things that are bad, you instruct the child in the way that they should do things. And that's a responsibility of a parent. So there's almost that implication there as well, as that one will be guided in love, and if the one makes a mistake, they'll just be re-guided to the right place. So there's no emphasis on sin here. And certainly when we talk about the creation of church doctrine, that was an idea that, not the first time that idea has appeared, but it was often rejected in the past. Because there's this idea that there needs to be some kind of punishment. It can't just be a, hey, everybody loves each other kind of thing. But I also don't think when she's talking about the mystical connection to the divine. Even though she's using these it seems paradoxical that she's using these very embodied terms, but she's not talking about something embodied. Probably a thing I could liken it to, if I try to think about how they fit. Again, we're the ones that separate it. There probably really is no separation between those concepts. But if you think about the Zen monks who will get up and they may spend the hours sweeping a floor, or doing some kind of a chore, very homely, domestic kind of a chore, as a meditation in and of itself. I remember a conversation I had about this years ago, when I liked going to work, and I would always have this, I worked in libraries mostly when I was younger, but there was just certain chores that you did. Like if you worked circulation, you brought the book drop in, you did certain things, you put certain things away, you had a certain routine that you did. And there was something about it, and some people say, oh God, that's just so boring to do that every day. It's like, yeah, but there's something about that. There's a meditation in that routine. And I think that's sometimes the reason that people like to keep busy with certain things, because there's a meditation in it, in the everyday, in the things that we do. So, anyway, this is a very interesting topic, and I probably have gone on for close to an hour. I always say to myself, I'm going to keep this short, and then that never happens, because then I get on. What would the correct phrase be? I get on a roll, I guess, on these different topics. So, in any case, I hope this one was illuminating, or at least interesting for you. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to once again thank my patrons. I always thank them at the beginning of the episode. Thank them again because a lot of the work I do would not be possible without them. So I am very grateful. People who are interested in joining my Patreon, I do often give extra podcasts and other benefits. There's swag and regular updates. And also access when I have mini lectures and courses and things that normally are under the paywall. You get a certain number of those free depending on what level you join at Patreon. So do consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia if you are not a member. My website is chthonia.net, which is where all of my work is. Good news, I should have actually some more books coming out this year. One of the things I'm doing today, after I get this podcast done and grade my midterm examinations for my students, then I'm going to be getting back into designing cover art for at least 2 or 3 new books that may be coming out this year. So I'll have more on that. That will be on chthonia.net, where there is a blog. I don't update it that often because a lot of people just don't read blogs, but I will have information there. You can find me on social media at Chthonia Podcast, one word, on Instagram, X, and I guess YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's just Chthonia, but you can find it under at Chthonia Podcast, one word. And it's Chthonia Podcast, 2 words, on Facebook. Also, just remind everybody about the Divine Feminine app. If you click on the link that's in the description, either for the podcast itself, or if you're on YouTube, I will have it in the description box there. If you click on that, that helps. That also helps me with my channel and helps support, because it is an affiliate link. So it gets more exposure for the Divine Feminine app, and then it also helps me out as well. So thank you again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.